It was just a short walk to the school bus stop. A walk 6-year-old Etan Patz had begged his parents to let him take on his own. But on that spring morning in New York City, he never made it to the bus. He never made it to school. And he never came home again. What happened in those few minutes would haunt his family and change America forever. It was Friday, May 25th, 1979. The streets of Soho, Manhattan were just beginning to stir awake. Delivery trucks rumbled across cobblestone streets. Shopkeepers rolled up metal shutters, and the spring air carried the promise of an ordinary day. But for one family, nothing about this day would end ordinary. This was the day 6-year-old Etan Patz vanished. Etan was like countless other kids in New York City, curious, playful, always carrying a smile that seemed too big for his small frame. He loved drawing, playing with his friends, and most of all, he loved his newfound independence. At just 6 years old, Etan had been begging his parents to let him do something he had never done before: walk to the school bus stop. Alone, for Stan and Julie Patz, Etan's parents. This decision didn't come lightly. The 1970s in New York weren't exactly known for safety. Crime rates were high. Stories of muggings, assaults, and worse seemed to fill the newspapers daily. But Soho felt different. Their neighborhood was familiar, filled with artists, shopkeepers, and neighbors who looked out for one another. And Etan's school bus stop? It was just 2 blocks away. So, on that spring morning, Julie Patz finally agreed. Etan could walk alone. It would be the first time, and the last. Etan woke up excited. He dressed himself in his favorite blue jeans, a striped shirt, and his little Eastern Airlines cap. He slung his school bag over his shoulder and said goodbye to his mom. Julie packed his lunch, kissed his forehead, and watched him leave their apartment. She would never see him again. The distance to the bus stop was less than a 5-minute walk. 2 blocks. Half a city street. Neighbors saw him walking, his small figure dwarfed by the tall Manhattan buildings. One remembered his cap. Another remembered his cheerful smile. But somewhere between his apartment and the yellow school bus that morning, Etan vanished. When the school day ended and Etan didn't return home, panic began to spread. At first, Julie thought maybe he had lingered with friends. But when she called the school, her heart sank. The teacher said Etan hadn't been in class at all. He never got on the bus that morning. By sunset, the Patz family knew something was terribly wrong. And by nightfall, the streets of Soho, filled with posters, flashlights, and the frantic cries of his name. Etan. Etan. But the boy with the striped shirt and the airline cap was gone. That night marked the beginning of one of the most famous missing child cases in American history. A case that would change the way America thought about safety, about children, and about the very idea of trust in a city neighborhood. But for the Patz family, it was just the beginning of a nightmare. Night had fallen over Manhattan, but in the Patz household, the lights blazed. 6-year-old Etan hadn't come home. His dinner sat untouched on the kitchen table, growing cold. And his mother, Julie, could no longer deny what her heart already knew. Something was terribly wrong. The Patz family picked up the phone and called the NYPD. Missing children in New York weren't rare, but police were used to runaways, teenagers, kids skipping school. Not a 6-year-old boy who had vanished on his very first walk to the bus stop. Officers arrived quickly, and within hours the Patz apartment turned into a command post. That night, dozens of police officers, neighbors, and volunteers flooded The streets of Soho. They combed through alleyways, basements, stairwells. Flashlights cut through the darkness as voices echoed, "Etan! Etan!" People knocked on doors. Shopkeepers were questioned. Taxi drivers were stopped. But every search came back empty. It was as if the earth had swallowed the little boy whole. By morning, the story of the missing boy spread like wildfire. The New York Times carried the headline. Local TV anchors spoke of a child in a striped shirt, last seen walking proudly with his school bag. And the image of Etan, bright-eyed, innocent, hopeful, began appearing everywhere. New York was a city used to crime. But the disappearance of a child? That cut deeper. Tips began pouring in. A shopkeeper thought he saw Etan buying a soda. A taxi driver swore he'd seen a boy with a baseball cap. Neighbor said she noticed a strange man lingering near the bus stop. Police chased every lead, every phone call, every shadow, but each one led to another dead end. For Stan and Julie Patz, the waiting was unbearable. Julie replayed the morning over and over in her head, his tiny hand waving goodbye, his little voice saying, "See you later, Mom." If only she had walked with him. If only she had kept him home that day. Stan tried to stay strong, talking to reporters, holding up photographs, begging for help. But at night, behind closed doors, his tears told another story. Within days, hundreds of volunteers joined the search. Schools, churches, entire blocks came together. Posters with Etan's face, wide smile, striped shirt, were plastered. Across New York. He became more than a missing boy. He became a symbol. Every parent saw their own child in Etan's eyes. Every stranger felt the fear in their bones. And the city of millions suddenly felt very small. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The tips slowed. The posters curled at the edges. And the Patz family faced the most painful question of all. If Etan wasn't found in those first hours, those first days, would he ever be found at all? By the second week of Etan's disappearance, Soho was no longer just a neighborhood searching for a missing boy. It had become the center of America's greatest nightmare. Major networks picked up the case. ABC, CBS, NBC. Every anchor spoke the same words. 6-year-old Etan Patz vanished on his way to school. His photograph, striped shirt, small cap, bright smile, flashed across millions of screens. Strangers who had never set foot in New York now felt the Patz family's pain. The question wasn't just, "Where is Etan?" anymore. It was, "Could this happen to my child too?" In the months that followed, Etan's face appeared in an unexpected place: milk cartons. For the first time in American history, missing children were printed on cartons across grocery stores. Every breakfast table became a reminder. Every parent pouring milk for their child saw the haunting eyes of Etan Patz staring back at them. The idea was simple: spread awareness. Keep these children alive in memory, and maybe, just maybe, someone would recognize them. Etan was the first. And soon, hundreds of missing children followed. The effect was immediate. Across the country, parents became more cautious. Suddenly, letting a 6-year-old walk 2 blocks to school didn't seem safe. Neighborhoods that once felt close-knit now felt full of shadows. The innocence of childhood, walking to school, playing in the street, was stolen that spring morning in 1979. Etan's disappearance had changed the very definition of safety in America. For Stan and Julie, the media attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, It kept Etan's story alive, spread his face across the nation. On the other, it meant every moment of their grief was public. Julie couldn't walk to the grocery store without whispers following her. Stan couldn't go to work without reporters asking the same painful question. Do you think he's still alive? With the nation watching, investigators doubled their efforts. Thousands of leads were followed. Psychics claimed visions. Sketch artists drew dozens of suspicious men. The FBI joined the case, but again and again, nothing. The trail grew colder with each passing week. And behind closed doors, detectives began whispering the words no parent wanted to hear. We may never find him. By the end of 1979, Etan wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a symbol. His smile was a reminder of what could be lost in the blink of an eye. His absence haunted playgrounds, classrooms, and family dinners. Etan Patz had become America's child, and yet the Patz family's home remained unbearably quiet. An empty seat at the table. A bedroom filled with toys that would never be played with again. But then, years later, a new name surfaced. A man with a dark past. A man whose story seemed to fit too perfectly into the mystery. Was this finally the break the Patz family had prayed for? Or was it another cruel dead end in a case built on shadows? By the early 1980s, 3 years had passed since Etan Patz vanished. The posters had faded. The milk cartons had been replaced with new faces. But for Stan and Julie Patz, the nightmare never ended. And then, police got their first big lead. His name was Jose Antonio Ramos, a drifter. A man with a dark history. And a man who lived just blocks away from the Patz family at the time of Etan's disappearance. Ramos was known to lure young boys. He was investigated in dozens of child abuse cases. And when detectives questioned him about Etan, his answers were chilling. He admitted he had taken a boy that looked like Etan on the very same day. But he claimed he let the boy go. No body. No evidence. Just words. And yet, police couldn't ignore the feeling that Ramos was hiding something. Ramos was eventually jailed, but not for Etan. He was convicted of abusing other children. As the years passed, he sat behind bars, taunting investigators with half-answers, half-truths. Julie Patz once said, He knows what happened to my son. But he'll never tell us. It was like chasing a ghost, a confession always just out of reach. But Ramos wasn't the only name. As Etan's case gained national attention, dozens of people came forward claiming responsibility. Some were disturbed individuals seeking fame. Some were drifters who wanted to manipulate the system. And some seemed to know details they shouldn't have known. Each confession raised hope, only to end in heartbreak. Police learned the cruel reality of high-profile cases. Everyone wanted to claim the story, even if it wasn't theirs to claim. For years, investigators circled Ramos like hawks. But the lack of physical evidence left them trapped. The Patz family wanted answers, the public wanted justice, and the police wanted closure. But the truth refused to show itself. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, Etan's case went cold. New cases filled the headlines. New missing children replaced his face on posters. But in the Patz home, Etan's room stayed the same. His toys, his drawings, his bed waiting for a boy who would never return. And then, decades later, just when hope had nearly died, another man stepped forward. This time, he didn't just hint. He didn't just confess. He gave chilling details, the kind of details only the real killer could know. Could this be the breakthrough America had waited for? Or yet another cruel twist in a story built on lies? For more than 3 decades, Etan Patz's case had haunted America. False leads, cold trails, a family torn apart by unanswered questions. And then, in 2012, a man walked into a New Jersey police station. His name was Pedro Hernandez. And what he said next stunned the world. Pedro Hernandez was not a name police had circled for years. He wasn't a notorious drifter. He wasn't a known predator. He was an ordinary man, a father, a husband, a quiet neighbor living just outside New York. But behind that quiet face lay a secret he had carried since 1979. In a calm voice, Hernandez told investigators, "I killed Etan Patz." He explained that on that morning, as Etan walked toward his bus stop, he had lured the boy into a convenience store basement where he once worked. He offered the child a soda, and then, according to his confession, he strangled him. Afterwards, he claimed he stuffed Etan's body into a bag and left it with the trash. Detectives leaned forward, listening closely. Hernandez wasn't vague. He spoke of the striped shirt, the little cap, the way Etan trusted him just for a moment before everything went dark. These were details the public didn't know. Details only the person who had been there could have described. In May 2012, more than 33 years after Etan's disappearance, police announced the arrest of Pedro Hernandez. News cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled. The world asked the same question: could this finally be it? Has the mystery of Etan Patz been solved? For Stan and Julie, the news was like reopening an old wound. On one hand, they wanted to believe it, that after decades of torment, they finally had the answer. On the other, they had been down this road before. False confessions, empty promises, cruel dead ends. Stan Patz said quietly, "We've heard too many stories. We'll wait for proof." And soon, cracks began to appear. Hernandez had a history of mental illness. He was known to blur reality with imagination. Family members claimed he had spoken about killing a child before, but no one took him seriously. Was he truly guilty? Or just another disturbed man attaching himself to a story bigger than himself? The case was now alive again, decades later, with a confession that shocked the nation. But was Pedro Hernandez really the man who took Etan Patz from the streets of Soho? Or was this yet another cruel twist in a mystery that refused to die? The only way to know was to put him on trial. More than 3 decades had passed since Etan Patz vanished on his short walk to the bus stop. The city had changed. Generations had grown up. But the mystery of Etan never faded. And now in 2015, the case was finally going to trial. Pedro Hernandez, the quiet store clerk who confessed, sat at the center of it all. The trial took place in a Manhattan courtroom, not far from the very streets where Etan had disappeared. Journalists packed every bench. Camera crews lined the sidewalks. And for the Patz family, walking into that room meant reopening the deepest wound of their lives. Julie Patz sat silently, clutching a tissue. Stan Patz stared straight ahead, unflinching, his face etched with decades of grief. This wasn't just another trial. This was history. Prosecutors began by playing Hernandez's videotaped confession. The jury watched as he described luring Etan into the basement, offering him a soda, and then choking the life out of him. His words were calm, his face expressionless, and the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. For a moment, it felt undeniable. This was the man, this was the killer, but then came the defense. They argued that Hernandez was mentally ill, that his confession was not a confession, but the product of delusion, a fantasy, a lie told so many times he believed it himself. They pointed out, no body was ever found. No physical evidence tied him to Etan, and Hernandez had been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. Could the word of a troubled man really be enough to convict? One by one, witnesses were called, former co-workers, family members, even childhood friends. Some recalled Hernandez making strange statements about hurting a child years earlier. Others swore he confessed long before he was ever arrested. But every story was blurred by time, distorted by memory. What was truth? What was rumor? For the Patz family, the trial was torture, hearing the details again, watching Etan's last moments described in cold, clinical words. It was like reliving the loss in slow motion, and yet they sat there every day, holding on to the hope that justice, after so many years, might finally be done. But then came the verdict. The jury deliberated. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. And when they finally returned, their decision stunned the courtroom. The courtroom was silent. Dozens of reporters leaned forward. The Patz family clutched each other's hands. After months of testimony, weeks of arguments, and decades of waiting, the jury was finally ready to deliver its verdict on Pedro Hernandez. The jury had been deliberating for hours, then days, then weeks. Every time the courtroom doors opened, hearts pounded. Was this it? Was justice finally about to be served? But the days dragged on. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers argued endlessly about evidence, about truth, about doubt. At last, the jury foreman stood. The judge asked the question that hung in the air like a heavy weight. Has the jury reached a verdict? The answer came like a thunderclap. We are deadlocked. The jury could not agree. Gasps filled the courtroom. It was the unthinkable outcome, a mistrial, after months of testimony, after decades of waiting. There would be no verdict. Hernandez sat quietly, almost dazed, as if he didn't fully grasp what had just happened. Julie Patz lowered her head, her tears spilling silently. Stan Patz's face hardened, a mixture of anger, frustration, and heartbreak. Outside, the world erupted. Headlines screamed, "No justice for Etan." Commentators debated endlessly. Was Hernandez a cold-blooded killer? Or a mentally ill man trapped in his own lies? For the American public, it felt like another cruel twist in a story that had already dragged on too long. But Stan and Julie refused to give up. They had waited more than 30 years for this moment. They weren't about to stop now. Stan spoke to the cameras with quiet resolve. We will not rest until the man who took our son is held accountable. And behind closed doors, prosecutors prepared for the unthinkable, a second trial. First trial had ended in heartbreak. But the question remained, would the second trial finally deliver justice? Or would the Patz family be forced to endure another crushing disappointment? The answer would change everything. The year was 2016. More than 37 years had passed since little Etan Patz vanished on his way to school. And once again, the name Pedro Hernandez echoed through the marble halls of a Manhattan courtroom. Asterisk, this time, there would be no mistakes. This time, prosecutors promised, justice would finally come. The second trial was even bigger than the first. The courtroom was packed daily, journalists, grieving parents, Curious onlookers. Et as in single quotes as photograph, frozen in time, sat on the prosecutor's table. That same striped shirt. That same hopeful smile. It was as if the boy himself was watching. The prosecutors came, prepared. They played Hernandez's videotaped confession again, frame by frame, showing his calm voice as he described luring Etan into the basement. They brought in experts to argue that Hernandez's words weren't fantasy, they were fact. That mentally ill or not, he knew exactly what he had done. They reminded the jury that Hernandez had repeated his confession to multiple people over the years. His family, his church group, even cellmates. This, they said, was no coincidence. This was truth. But the defense fought back with equal fire. They insisted Hernandez was delusional, a man plagued by hallucinations and fantasies. They pointed out, again, the lack of physical evidence. No body, no fingerprints, no trace of Etan Patz anywhere. And they asked the jury the hardest question of all. Can you send a man to prison for life, based only on his words? Stan and Julie Patz sat through it all, every word, every painful detail, every photograph of the little boy they had lost. They had spent nearly 4 decades searching for answers. Now at last those answers were within reach. Asterisk, asterisk. And yet, the uncertainty was crushing. For months, the trial dragged on. Witness after witness, expert after expert. Conflicting stories blurred into one another. The jury's faces gave nothing away. Were they convinced? Or were they, like the first jury, trapped in doubt? And then, after months of testimony, the judge gave the final instruction. Members of the jury, you may now deliberate. 12 strangers walked into a small room, and the world held its breath once again. Would this be another heartbreak? Or would the Patz family finally hear the words they had waited nearly 4 decades to hear? It was April 18, 2017, nearly 38 years since 6-year-old Etan Patz disappeared on a spring morning in Soho. The second trial of Pedro Hernandez had stretched for months. And now, the jury had finally reached a decision. The courtroom was silent, heavy with expectation. Reporters clutched their pens. Cameras pointed at the double doors. Stan and Julie Patz sat together in the front row, hands clasped tightly, as if bracing for impact. The judge entered. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. No one in the room breathed. The foreman rose, holding the slip of paper that would decide the fate of Pedro Hernandez, and perhaps bring closure to decades of pain. The clerk asked the question, on the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, how do you find the defendant? The foreman's voice rang out, guilty. Gasps, sobs, and whispers filled the courtroom. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the words had been spoken. Someone was finally held accountable for the disappearance of Etan Patz. Pedro Hernandez sat slumped, his face blank, as if the weight of his own words had finally crashed down on him. Julie Patz wept silently. Stan Patz stared straight ahead, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over him. This wasn't victory, it wasn't joy. But it was something they had been denied for too long. Justice. News outlets erupted across America. Etan Patz case finally ends. Pedro Hernandez found guilty. For millions who had followed the case since 1979, it felt like the closing of a chapter that had haunted the nation. But for others, questions remained. Was Hernandez truly guilty? Or had the system chosen closure over truth? The Patz family walked out of the courtroom quietly. There were no celebrations. No smiles. Because at the end of it all, nothing could bring Etan back. No verdict could erase the decades of pain. But at least, after so many years of shadows, lies, and false confessions, there was an answer. And yet, the haunting truth remained. Etan's body was never found. The details of what happened that morning may never be fully known. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But for Stan and Julie Patz, the wound could never fully heal. Etan Patz never made it to school on that spring morning in 1979. But his story traveled farther than anyone could have imagined. Even though his life ended far too soon, his disappearance changed America forever. Etan was the very first missing child to appear on a milk carton. That one small photograph at the breakfast table sparked a movement. Soon, children across the nation were featured. Faces that might have been forgotten were suddenly seen by millions. For the first time, America realized that missing children weren't rare tragedies. They were everywhere. And Etan's smile became the symbol of that awakening. His disappearance didn't just stay in headlines. It reshaped laws. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th, the day Etan disappeared, as National Missing Children's Day, a day of remembrance, a day of action. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded soon after, directly inspired by cases like Etan's. Today, that organization has helped bring thousands of missing children back home, all because one little boy never made it back. For Stan and Julie Patz, the loss was immeasurable. They carried Etan in their hearts every single day. Julie once said, "We can never move on. We can only move forward." Their fight for justice became their life's mission, not just for Etan, but for every missing child. Etan's case tore away the illusion of safety that many families once believed in. But it also built something new: awareness. Parents began to talk to their children about safety, about strangers, about trust. In a way, Etan's story saved lives of children who might otherwise have vanished into silence. Even decades later, people still speak Etan's name every May 25th. Candles are lit, stories are told, and people remember the boy with the striped shirt and bright smile who never came home. He is not forgotten, and he never will be. The story of Etan Patz is not just about loss. It's about the power of one child's life to change a nation. Came late. Closure was incomplete. But Etan's legacy lives on in every child found, every family reunited, and every parent who hugs their child a little tighter before letting them go.